It was the late 1960s, and America's racetracks were more than just ovals of asphalt. They were battlegrounds where pride, power, and corporate dominance clashed at 200 miles per hour. NASCAR wasn't just a sport. It was war with engines, sheet metal, and aerodynamics as the weapons of choice. At the center of it all stood Chrysler Corporation, a company with two performance-driven brands, Dodge and Plymouth. Both were desperate to prove themselves on the high banks of Daytona, Talladega, and Atlanta. Both were chasing one thing: victory over Ford, Chevrolet, and each other. But by 1968, the problem was clear. Chrysler's cars were powerful but aerodynamically clumsy. The Dodge Charger RT, for all its muscle, was more brick than bullet when it hit NASCAR's long straights. Competitors like Ford's Torino, Talladega were slicing through the air, leaving Dodge drivers frustrated in their wake. The executives at Chrysler knew something had to change. If Dodge wanted to win on Sunday and sell on Monday, it needed more than horsepower. It needed science, wind, tunnels, engineers, and a willingness to break every rule of design became the new weapons. What emerged was nothing short of shocking. A machine so radical, so unlike anything else on the road that it would forever rewrite the rules of stock car racing. Its name? The Dodge Charger Daytona. Just when Dodge thought it had the sport conquered, Plymouth fired back with a car so wild it looked like it belonged in a cartoon, the Plymouth Superbird. Together, these two machines would ignite one of the most dramatic rivalries in NASCAR history, a clash that would shake the sport to its core and force officials to step in. This is the story of the Aero Monster, the demon on wheels, the Dodge Charger Daytona, and the Plymouth Superbird, the Daytona's arrival, Dodge's radical gamble. In 1968, Dodge was in trouble on the NASCAR circuit. The Charger RT, with its big block engines and muscular stance, looked fearsome but performed poorly on the track. Drivers complained of instability at high speeds. The fastback roofline created lift, turning the rear end of the car into a liability. Ford and Mercury cars were eating Dodge alive, and every loss was a public embarrassment. For Chrysler, racing wasn't just about trophies, it was about sales. The saying, "win on Sunday, sell on Monday," was gospel. NASCAR victories translated directly into dealership traffic, and Dodge dealers were desperate for wins. The pressure landed squarely on the engineers' shoulders. Enter the Aero Warriors. Instead of focusing solely on horsepower, Dodge made a radical decision: fix the car's aerodynamics. The team went to work in a wind tunnel, something almost unheard of in stock car racing at the time. What they discovered was shocking. With the right tweaks, the Charger could slice through the air like a fighter jet, instead of stumbling like a brick. The result was the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, a car so outrageous it looked like it had rolled straight out of science fiction. Its most infamous feature was the massive 18-inch nose cone, a pointed aerodynamic spear designed to cut drag on the straights. Bolted to the rear was a towering 23-inch wing, so high it could clear the trunk lid and generate downforce without interfering with airflow. Critics mocked it, fans gasped at it, but engineers knew it worked. The Daytona was more than just a styling experiment. Under the hood sat Dodge's most brutal engines, the 440 Magnum and the legendary 426 Hemi. With up to 425 horsepower, the Daytona had the muscle to match its radical looks. But it was the aerodynamics that transformed it into something no one had seen before, a car that could break the 200 miles per hour barrier on a NASCAR track. When the Daytona hit the circuits in 1969, the results were immediate and shocking. Charlie Glotzbach drove one to a record-shattering 200.447 miles per hour lap at Talladega, making the Daytona the first NASCAR machine to officially break 200 miles per hour. It was a milestone that proved Dodge's gamble had paid off. Rival teams stared in absolute disbelief. What they were witnessing didn't seem possible. The Daytona wasn't just fast, it was something more. It carried itself with a kind of authority. On the track, moving through the air with a stability that other cars could only dream of. Lap after lap, the Daytona didn't falter. It didn't twitch, it didn't lose its balance, and it didn't give rivals even the slightest chance to exploit weakness. It was stable, it was consistent, and above all else, it was nearly unbeatable on the long, punishing superspeedways where sheer speed separated legends from losers. In its debut season, the Daytona proved every doubter wrong. 6 victories were officially recorded, but the story was about more than just numbers. It was about the countless top finishes, the podiums, and the unshakable presence that the car demanded every time it rolled out onto the grid. The Daytona didn't just win races, it dominated them, leaving competitors scrambling for answers that never came. For Dodge, it was sweet vindication. All the criticism about the nose cone, all the laughter about the towering rear wing, all the talk of the Daytona being an ugly duckling, evaporated in the roar of victory. What had once been mocked now stood tall as the swan. Of the racetrack, elegant in its speed, ruthless in its efficiency, and unstoppable in its pursuit of glory, the Daytona had arrived, and NASCAR would never look the same again. But in the corporate halls of Chrysler, a new rivalry was brewing. Dodge had its glory, but Plymouth, Chrysler's sister brand, wanted a piece of the action. Plymouth dealers were furious that Dodge was hogging the spotlight, and they demanded their own aero warrior. Dodge had built the Daytona with one clear objective in mind: to win races. Every line, every curve, and every inch of that machine was designed with the singular purpose of crossing the finish line first. It was raw, aggressive, and unapologetically focused on the science of speed. The Daytona was a weapon, forged for victory on NASCAR's high speed. Ovals, but Plymouth's vision went beyond the checkered flag. Plymouth was about to build a car that wasn't just engineered to win, it was crafted to capture imaginations. They wanted something that would win hearts, dominate headlines, and carve out an even larger share of NASCAR glory for Chrysler. It wasn't enough to match the Daytona. Plymouth intended to outshine it in spectacle, presence, and impact. And so, the stage was set for a rivalry unlike anything the sport had seen before. Out of Plymouth's ambition came a machine that would redefine what an aero car could be. This was the Plymouth Superbird, a car designed not only to compete with the Daytona, but to take everything Dodge had accomplished and amplify it. It was louder, bolder, and more audacious, a rolling statement that Plymouth wasn't content with second place. The Superbird was more than a car. It was a symbol of escalation, a machine that took the formula Dodge had written and turned it up to 11. What the Daytona had started, the Superbird was ready to finish. The Superbird strikes back. If the Dodge Charger Daytona was shocking, the Plymouth Superbird was something else entirely. A car born out of pride, desperation, and one man's legendary reputation: Richard Petty. In 1969, while Dodge was basking in its Daytona victories, Plymouth was sulking in the shadows. NASCAR was a battlefield, but it was also a marketing machine, and Plymouth dealers hated being second fiddle to Dodge. Customers were asking about Daytonas, not road runners. for a brand that had built its reputation on being fun, loud, and youthful, the embarrassment was unbearable. But the real blow came when Plymouth lost its biggest star, Richard the King Petty. Petty had driven Plymouths for years, giving the brand immense credibility. But when he saw Plymouth had no answer to Dodge's Daytona, he jumped ship to Ford for the 1969 season. It was a betrayal that rocked Plymouth to its core. The King himself had abandoned them because they weren't competitive. Chrysler's leadership knew something drastic had to be done if Plymouth wanted to reclaim Petty and its dignity. They needed a car that could not only match the Daytona, but surpass it. And so, in 1970, Plymouth unveiled their ultimate weapon, the Plymouth Road Runner Superbird. On paper, the Superbird looked like a Daytona clone. It shared the same long nose cone and giant rear wing, but Plymouth didn't want to just copy Dodge. Their engineers made subtle changes. The nose was slightly more pointed, the wing was adjusted for balance, and the body lines were tailored to the Roadrunner's shape. The result was even more dramatic, almost cartoonish, like a hot rod exaggerated in a Saturday morning sketch. Plymouth knew the looks alone would stir controversy. That's why they leaned into it. To tie the car to its popular beep beep Roadrunner image, they slapped Warner Brothers cartoon decals all over it, a cheeky move that made the car unforgettable. The Superbird was equal parts science experiment and marketing stunt. But the car's most important role wasn't in showrooms. It was on the track and in Richard Petty's garage. Plymouth went to Petty with the Superbird and asked him to come back. With its radical aerodynamics and Chrysler's HEMI engines under the hood, the Superbird was everything Petty had wanted. In 1970, the King returned home to Plymouth, sliding behind the wheel of the wildest car NASCAR had ever seen, and the results devastating. The Superbird tore through the competition, clocking wins and making fans' jaws drop. Petty alone drove the car to 8 victories in 1970, while other drivers in Superbirds added even more. On superspeedways like Daytona and Talladega, it was virtually untouchable. Fans loved it. Rivals hated it. NASCAR officials were terrified of it. The Superbird wasn't just fast. It was a spectacle. Crowds came just to see the massive winged monster blasting down the straights, a cartoon bird on its side and a legend at the wheel. Together, the Daytona and the Superbird had turned NASCAR upside down. 2 outrageous aero monsters, each representing sibling brands, were rewriting the rulebook. But with their dominance came a problem. They were too good. NASCAR couldn't handle cars that could blow past 200 miles per hour with ease, and rival teams cried foul. The rivalry between the Daytona and Superbird had pushed stock car racing into a new, dangerous era, one that would soon be cut short by the rule makers, NASCAR's Aero Wars and the ban. By 1970, NASCAR was no longer a battle of driver skill alone. It was an aerodynamic arms race. The Dodge Charger, Daytona, and Plymouth Superbird weren't just fast, they were rewriting the physics of stock car racing. On tracks like Talladega and Daytona, the winged warriors blasted down the straights at 200+ miles per hour, speeds that had previously seemed unreachable in a stock car. Fans were thrilled. The sound, the spectacle, the sheer insanity of a cartoon-badged Plymouth or a menacing Dodge slicing through the air like a jet fighter. It was unlike anything the sport had ever seen, but for NASCAR officials, it was a nightmare. Safety was already a growing concern. Cars were going faster than the tracks, barriers, and medical teams were prepared for. When a winged Dodge or Plymouth showed up, it wasn't just competitive, it was dominant, leaving Ford, Chevy, and even other Mopars in the dust. Competitors cried foul, calling the aero cars unfair. The winged machines weren't just tweaking stock designs, they were bending the definition of stock car. To race these cars, Dodge and Plymouth had built limited street versions, the infamous homologation. Specials by rule, NASCAR required about 500 production cars for sale to the public. That's how those wild Daytonas and Superbirds ended up in dealerships. But here's the twist. Hardly anyone wanted to buy them. The average customer walking into a Plymouth or Dodge showroom in 1970 didn't want a 6-foot wing bolted to the back of their family car. Many sat unsold on lots, sometimes discounted just to get rid of them. Some dealers even removed the wings and nose cones to make them more sellable. Ironically, the cars that nobody wanted in 1970 are now million-dollar collector pieces. Meanwhile, on the track, the aero cars kept winning. Richard Petty in his Superbird and Buddy Baker in his Daytona dominated superspeedways. In March 1970, Baker became the first NASCAR driver to break the 200-mile-per-hour barrier during a test run at Talladega A milestone that proved just how far these machines had pushed the sport. For NASCAR, that was the last straw. The sanctioning body feared the speeds were getting out of hand. Fans wanted excitement, but officials worried that one crash at 200 miles per hour could end in disaster. So, in 1971, NASCAR made a decision that would change history. They effectively banned the aero cars. The new rules restricted engine sizes for aerodynamic-bodied cars. Winged machines like the Daytona and Superbird were limited to 305 cubic inches, far smaller than the big block monsters they'd been running. Overnight, their competitiveness evaporated. The aero cars went from being the kings of NASCAR to being obsolete curiosities. The Daytona and Superbird had only lived at the top for 2 seasons, yet in that short span, they became legends. Their rivalry, Dodge versus Plymouth, Daytona versus Superbird, had pushed NASCAR into new territory, forced innovations in aerodynamics, and created 2 of the most iconic race cars ever built. But their time in the spotlight was over. NASCAR had slammed the brakes on the aero wars, leaving the winged warriors as glorious but short-lived reminders of what happens when engineers are allowed to run wild. Legacy of the winged warriors. When NASCAR pulled the plug on the aero wars in 1971, it seemed like the end of the line. For the Dodge Charger Daytona and Plymouth Superbird, their radical designs were outlawed, their competitive edge stripped away, and the unsold dealer cars became awkward oddities of the muscle car era. For a while, they looked destined to be nothing, more than forgotten relics of a short-lived experiment, but time has a funny way of rewriting history. In the decades that followed, the legend of the winged warriors only grew. What was once considered excessive or even ridiculous, a giant fiberglass nose cone and a towering aluminum wing became symbols of engineering genius. Collectors and enthusiasts began to realize that these cars weren't just strange footnotes, they were milestones in American motorsport. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, interest in muscle cars surged, and the Daytona and Superbird were rediscovered as the ultimate expression of the era. Suddenly, the very cars that dealers once struggled to give away were selling at auctions for 6-figure sums. Today, pristine examples can fetch well over $1 million, especially those with racing pedigree or original engines. Beyond their value, the cars carried something bigger: mythology. The Charger Daytona became known as the first stock car to crack 200 miles per hour, a record that stamped its name in history forever. the Superbird became inseparable from Richard Petty, the king of NASCAR, cementing its place as one of the most recognizable race cars ever. Car culture embraced their outrageousness. Kids who once laughed at the cartoon road runner badge on a Superbird grew up to revere it as a piece of motorsport art. The Daytona and Superbird began appearing in video games, movies, and even animated films like Cars, ensuring that new generations discovered their story. More importantly, these cars left behind a legacy of innovation. They proved that aerodynamics mattered in stock car racing, something NASCAR teams had largely ignored. After the ban, teams still experimented with airflow, body shapes, and downforce, but they were never again allowed the wild freedom that produced the winged Mopars. In a sense, the Daytona and Superbird had pushed the sport forward so far, so fast, that the rulebook had to slam shut just to catch up. For Dodge and Plymouth, the cars also became lasting emblems of a daring era when American manufacturers weren't afraid to take risks, even though Plymouth as a brand is long gone. The Superbird's wing and nose remain instantly recognizable. Dodge, meanwhile, has leaned into the Daytona's legend with modern tributes, including special edition Chargers that echo the car's name and heritage. Today, when enthusiasts see a Daytona or Superbird at a car show, it's not just another muscle car. It's a symbol of what happens when engineers chase victory without compromise. It's a story of sibling rivalry, Dodge versus Plymouth, that changed NASCAR forever, only to be cut short by the rule makers. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most radical ideas, even if they last only briefly, shine the brightest. The Dodge Charger, Daytona, and Plymouth Superbird weren't just cars, they were rolling middle fingers to convention, built for one purpose: to dominate. For 2 glorious seasons, they did exactly that. And though NASCAR may have banned them, history has crowned them as legends. If you enjoyed this incredible story, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more epic automotive adventures. Your support keeps these stories alive.